They Live by Night wasn't supposed to change cinema. It was a small film noir that almost never saw a theater. The studio buried it, the director was unknown, and the leads, they were kids playing criminals on the run. But hidden in those shadows was something revolutionary, a helicopter shot that defied gravity, a love story filmed in secret, and a debut so powerful it launched one of Hollywood's most tortured auteurs. These are 20 weird facts about They Live by Night. And the bonus? A title change so drastic, even the director didn't see it coming. Buckle up. This film lived fast and left scars. They Live by Night marked Nicholas Ray's first time behind the camera as a director, but he didn't arrive on set as some naive newcomer. He'd spent years absorbing everything he could from the edges of Hollywood, working as an assistant to Elia Kazan on Broadway and studying under the legendary director John Houseman. Ray had been preparing for this moment his entire adult life, learning blocking, pacing, how to work with actors who brought their own damaged histories to the screen. But when RKO Pictures finally gave him his shot, it came with strings attached. They handed him a script based on Edward Anderson's novel Thieves Like Us, a Depression-era tale of doomed lovers and desperate criminals. The studio wanted something cheap, fast, and forgettable. Ray saw something else entirely. He saw a chance to make a film that didn't just tell a story about crime, but about isolation, about two people trying to escape a world that had already written their ending. So, he took the assignment, knowing it might be his only chance. And from day one, he approached it like a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Before Farley Granger became the face of Bowie, the young fugitive desperate for redemption, the role almost went to someone completely different. RKO had their eye on actors with more traditional leading man credentials, faces that could sell tickets and charm audiences into forgetting they were watching criminals. But Nicholas Ray didn't want charm. He wanted vulnerability. He wanted someone who looked like they'd been kicked around by life and still somehow believed in something better. Granger had that quality. At just 23 years old, he carried himself with a strange mix of boyish innocence and world-weary exhaustion. He'd served in World War II, seen things that aged him faster than any script could, and when he read for the part, he didn't play Bowie as a tough guy or a romantic hero. He played him as a kid who never had a chance. Ray watched him audition and knew instantly. This wasn't just casting, it was fate. Granger brought a quiet desperation to the role, a sense that every smile was borrowed time, every moment of happiness stolen from a future that didn't exist. The studio wasn't thrilled, they wanted star power. Ray wanted truth, and in the end, truth won. Barely. Kathy O'Donnell wasn't. Supposed to be fragile, she was supposed to be strong, a woman who could stand beside a criminal and make you believe she chose that life. But what Ray discovered when she arrived on set was something even more powerful than strength. It was resilience wrapped in softness, a woman who looked like the world could break her, but somehow never did. O'Donnell had been working steadily since her breakout role in The Best Years of Our Lives, but this was different. In They Live by Night, she played Kichi, a gas station attendant who falls for Bowie, knowing full well it might destroy them both. And O'Donnell didn't play her as a victim or a fool. She played her as someone who'd been alone so long that love, even doomed love, felt like the only thing worth risking everything for. Ray gave her space to find the character, to let the silences speak as loudly as the dialogue. There's a moment early in the film where Kichi looks at Bowie and you can see her deciding to fall, knowing she'll hit the ground but not caring. O'Donnell made you feel that fall. She didn't overact. She didn't push. She just existed in that fragile, dangerous space between hope and grief. And it shattered audiences who weren't expecting a crime film to hurt this much. The opening shot of They Live by Night wasn't just innovative, it was impossible. In 1948, helicopter cinematography was still experimental, risky, expensive, and rarely attempted outside of military or documentary work. But Nicholas Ray wanted something no one had ever seen before. He wanted to start the film from the sky, looking down at Bowie and Kichi driving through empty fields, two tiny figures in a stolen car racing toward nowhere. The shot required a helicopter, a specially mounted camera, precise coordination with the actors below, and weather that wouldn't tear the whole operation apart. They had one chance to get it right. One take before the budget ran out and the studio pulled the plug. The crew rigged the camera, the helicopter lifted off, and the actors drove. The camera swooped down, tracking them through dirt roads and open land, capturing them as small and vulnerable as Ray intended. It worked, barely. The shot became one of the most iconic openings in film noir history, a visual representation of fate closing in from above. But at the time, no one knew if it would even make the final cut. Ray fought for it. He believed that first image had to set the tone. These people were already caught. They just didn't know it yet. Howard Hughes didn't direct They Live by Night, but his fingerprints were all over its fate. By the time the film wrapped in 1948, Hughes had taken control of RKO Pictures, and with that control came chaos. Hughes was a billionaire aviator obsessed with micromanaging every film under his studio's banner, often to disastrous effect. He delayed releases, demanded reshoots, shelved completed films for years, and turned RKO into a graveyard for projects that never saw daylight. They Live by Night became one of his victims. Despite positive test screenings and strong word of mouth within the industry, Hughes held the film back. He didn't think it had commercial potential. He didn't believe audiences wanted to watch a depressing love story about criminals who lose. So, he buried it. For nearly 2 years, the film sat on a shelf, completed but unreleased, while Nicholas Ray watched his debut gather dust. During that time, Ray directed other projects, built his reputation elsewhere, but the sting of watching his first film trapped in limbo never faded. When They Live by Night finally hit theaters in 1949, it was almost an afterthought, a film released quietly without fanfare or promotion. The studio didn't believe in it, but critics did. And slowly, against all odds, audiences started to notice that something special had been hiding in the shadows all along. The film wasn't always called They Live by Night. In fact, that title came later, almost as an afterthought, a poetic rebranding of something darker and more direct. The original title was The Twisted Road, a name that captured the noir fatalism of the story, but lacked the haunting beauty Ray wanted. Even earlier drafts carried the novel's original title, Thieves Like Us. But the studio worried this sounded too literary, too bleak, too honest about what audiences were about to watch. Ray preferred They Live by Night, because it suggested something more than just crime. It suggested a life lived in the margins, in stolen moments, under cover of darkness. It hinted at tenderness buried in desperation. But the title change wasn't just poetic license, it was survival. RKO needed something that sounded romantic enough to sell tickets, but still carried the weight of the tragedy underneath. They tested various options with focus groups, and They Live by Night resonated. It sounded like a love story. It sounded like something that might end with hope, and in a way it did, just not the kind of hope anyone wanted. The title change worked. It softened the edges just enough to get people in the theater, and once they were there, Ray made sure they felt every ounce of the darkness he'd always intended. Nicholas Ray didn't just direct the actors, he lived with them. Not literally, but close enough that the line between filmmaker and confidant blurred into something almost familial. Ray believed that to capture the desperation and intimacy of Bowie and Keachie's relationship, Farley Granger and Kathy O'Donnell needed to trust him completely. So he spent hours talking to them off-set, not about the script, but about their lives, their fears, their own experiences with loneliness and longing. He wanted them to bring something real to the roles, something that couldn't be faked or performed. Granger later said, Ray made him feel like the film mattered more than anything else in the world, that every take was a chance to get closer to something true. O'Donnell said, Ray never raised his voice, never pushed, but somehow made you want to give him everything you had. That approach paid off. The chemistry between Granger and O'Donnell didn't feel acted. It felt lived in, raw, fragile in all the right ways. There's a scene where they talk about getting married, and you can see them both knowing it's a fantasy, but choosing to believe it anyway. That wasn't in the script. That was Ray giving them space to find the sadness underneath the hope. And they found it. Every time. The wedding scene almost didn't happen. Budget constraints, time limitations, and studio pressure meant Ray was constantly fighting to keep moments that felt essential, but weren't advancing the plot fast enough for RKO's taste. The wedding, where Bowie and Keachie marry in a small roadside ceremony officiated by a justice of the peace, was one of those moments. On paper, it was expendable. In Ray's vision, it was the heart of the film. This was the one moment where these two broken people got to pretend, just for a second, that they were normal, that they deserved happiness, that the world might let them have it. Ray shot it quickly, quietly, almost guerrilla style, making sure he had it in the can before anyone could tell him to cut it. He knew if he didn't capture it immediately, the studio would force him to move on. And he was right. When the production schedule was reviewed later, executives questioned why time had been spent on a scene that didn't involve action or advancing the chase. Ray defended it fiercely. He told them the wedding wasn't about plot. It was about showing the audience what these characters were losing. Without that moment, the ending would just be tragedy. With it, it became heartbreak. The scene stayed. And it became one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire film. The gun wasn't supposed to go off. In the climactic final sequence, Bowie is cornered by police, trapped in a situation with no escape, and in a moment of panic and desperation, he reaches for a weapon. The scene was choreographed carefully, timed to the second, but during one take, something went wrong. The prop gun, which was supposed to fire blanks, misfired. The sound was louder than expected, sharper, and it startled everyone on set. Farley Granger flinched, genuinely shaken, and Nicholas Ray kept the cameras rolling. He saw something in that moment of real fear, something he couldn't have directed or scripted. Granger's reaction wasn't acting anymore. It was survival instinct, the look of a man who realizes he's out of options. Ray used that take in the final cut. He never told Granger until later that what he'd captured was the moment the actor stopped performing and started feeling what Bowie felt, trapped, terrified, and too young to die. It's one of the rawest moments in the film, and it only exists because of a technical mistake that Ray turned into something unforgettable. A movie about people living on borrowed time. Even the accidents felt like fate.
I knew that tire had to go.
Critics didn't know what to make of They Live by Night when it finally limped into theaters in 1949. Some called it too slow, too soft for a crime film, too focused on romance when audiences wanted action. Others saw something different. They saw a film that didn't follow the rules, that cared more about its characters than its genre, that dared to suggest that criminals could be human, tragic, even worth mourning. In France, the film found its most passionate defenders. The young critics at Cahiers du Cinéma, who would later become directors themselves, hailed Nicholas Ray as a visionary. They saw in his debut the birth of a new kind of American cinema, one that blended noir fatalism with emotional depth, that used shadows not just for style, but for meaning. François Truffaut called it one of the most beautiful films he'd ever seen. Jean-Luc Godard dedicated his own debut, Breathless, to Ray. And slowly, across oceans and decades, They Live by Night stopped being a forgotten RKO crime picture and became something else entirely, a masterpiece. Not because it succeeded on release, but because it refused to die. Just like Bowie and Kichi, the film Live by Night survived in the margins and eventually found the audience it always deserved. The gas station wasn't a set. It was a real location, miles outside Los Angeles, chosen specifically because Nicholas Ray wanted authenticity over convenience. He didn't want painted backdrops or studio-controlled environments. He wanted dust, heat, isolation, the kind of place where Kichi could believably spend her days waiting for something, anything, to happen. But shooting on location in 1948 came with problems the studio hadn't anticipated. There was no electricity for the lights. The crew had to run generators that kept overheating in the desert sun. There was no catering, no trailers, no bathrooms except for a single outhouse that everyone from the director to the stars had to share. Kathy O'Donnell later joked that the discomfort actually helped her performance. Kichi was supposed to look worn down, tired of her life, and after spending 12-hour days in 100-degree heat with minimal shade, O'Donnell didn't have to act. The exhaustion was real. Ray pushed for these conditions not because he was cruel, but because he believed that comfort breeds complacency. He wanted his actors uncomfortable, raw, present, and it worked. Every scene at that gas station feels lived in, real, like you're watching people actually surviving rather than performing survival. The studio hated the added expense and complications. Ray didn't care. He got what he needed, and the authenticity shows in every frame. The kiss wasn't in the script, at least not the way it ended up on screen. Nicholas Ray had blocked out a simple romantic moment between Bowie and Kichi, a standard Hollywood kiss that would, signal their growing connection. But when Farley Granger and Kathy O'Donnell played the scene during rehearsal, something shifted. The kiss became hesitant, almost awkward. Two people who wanted connection but didn't quite know how to take it. Ray watched the rehearsal and immediately stopped them. Instead of correcting it, he told them to do it exactly that way when the cameras rolled. He wanted the uncertainty, the fumbling quality of two people who'd been alone so long they'd almost forgotten how to touch another human being. When they filmed it, the crew went silent. It was one of the most tender, vulnerable moments any of them had ever witnessed on a film set. No sweeping music, no dramatic lighting, just two young actors discovering what their characters meant to each other in real time. The scene made it into the final cut exactly as they had stumbled through it, and it became one of the most talked about moments in the film. Because it didn't look like movie romance. It looked like two damaged people learning to hope again. And that was more powerful than any choreographed passion could ever be. Howard Da Silva played Chickamauga, the violent, unpredictable criminal who drags Bowie deeper into a life he never wanted. On screen, Da Silva was terrifying, a man whose rage could explode at any moment. Off screen, he was about to become one of Hollywood's most tragic casualties. Just as They Live by Night was making its delayed journey to theaters, the House Un-American Activities Committee was ramping up its investigation into alleged communist infiltration in Hollywood. Da Silva, who had been politically active and openly left-leaning, found himself on the blacklist. His career, which had been building steadily through the 1940s, came to a screeching halt. Studios refused to hire him. Projects he'd been attached to quietly found other actors. For nearly a decade, one of the most talented character actors in Hollywood couldn't work. And the cruel irony? They Live by Night, the film that showcased some of his finest work, was finally getting recognition just as his career was being destroyed. Nicholas Ray, who would later face his own political scrutiny, watched helplessly as the system he worked within devoured one of his actors. Da Silva eventually returned to acting in the 1960s, but the damage was done. Those lost years, those roles he never got to play, they haunted him. And They Live by Night stands as a reminder of what Hollywood lost when fear became more powerful than talent.
Yeah.
The car crash wasn't in the original script. Nicholas Ray added it during production, realizing he needed a visual metaphor for the destruction that was chasing Bowie and Kichi. But actually staging a car crash in 1948 required real vehicles, real stunt drivers, and real danger. CGI didn't exist. Safety protocols were minimal at best. If you wanted to crash a car on camera, someone had to actually crash a car. Ray worked with a stunt coordinator to plan the sequence meticulously, choosing an isolated stretch of road where they could control the environment. They had one car, one driver, and one chance to get it right. Reshoots weren't in the budget. The stunt driver climbed behind the wheel, accelerated to the planned speed, and at the designated mark, jerked the steering wheel hard. The car flipped, rolled, and came to rest upside down in a cloud of dust and twisted metal. The crew ran to check on the driver, who emerged shaken but uninjured. Ray got his shot. But watching the playback, something bothered him. The crash was spectacular, violent, exactly what he'd planned. But it was also too much. It threatened to overshadow the emotional core of the film, to turn the story into an action spectacle when he wanted intimacy and tragedy. In the final edit, Ray used only a few seconds of the crash, cutting away before it became exploitative. He needed the danger, not the spectacle. And that restraint, that choice to pull back when everything in Hollywood pushed for more, defined his approach to the entire film. The jazz score almost didn't exist. RKO wanted a traditional orchestral soundtrack, sweeping strings and dramatic crescendos that told the audience exactly what to feel. Nicholas Ray wanted something different. He wanted music that felt like the world Bowie and Kichi inhabited, spontaneous, melancholic, alive in the darkness. He pushed for jazz, specifically the kind of late-night, after-hours jazz that played in small clubs where people went to disappear. The studio resisted. Jazz in 1948 was still considered too urban, too black, too dangerous for mainstream Hollywood. But Ray fought for it, arguing that the music needed to reflect the character's existence on society's margins. He brought in composer Lee Harleen, who'd worked on Disney films but understood what Ray wanted, music that didn't announce itself, that lived in the shadows alongside the characters. Harleen crafted a score that used jazz elements subtly, weaving them into the traditional orchestration, so the studio wouldn't notice just how radical it actually was. The result was one of the first film noir soundtracks to embrace jazz as more than background color. It became part of the film's DNA, a sonic representation of lives lived outside the rules. And when French New Wave directors watched They Live by Night years later, they heard that jazz and recognized something revolutionary, a film that understood music could be as important as dialogue, as meaningful as any image on screen. Farley Granger nearly walked away from the film. Midway through production, exhausted from the emotional demands of playing Bowie and frustrated by the grueling location shoots, Granger went to Nicholas Ray and said he didn't think he could finish. He felt like he was drowning in the character's despair, carrying the weight of a doomed man every day, and he didn't know how to separate himself from it anymore. Ray didn't give him a pep talk. He didn't tell him it would get easier. Instead, he told Granger the truth. It wouldn't get easier because Bowie's story didn't get easier, and if Granger could walk away from that pain, then he wasn't the right actor for the role. It was harsh, maybe even cruel, but it worked. Granger stayed. He stopped trying to protect himself from the emotional toll and let it consume him. His performance in the final third of the film carries a weight that only comes from genuine suffering, from an actor who stopped performing tragedy and started living it. Years later, Granger admitted that making They Live by Night was one of the most difficult experiences of his career, but also one of the most important. He learned that sometimes the roles that hurt you the most are the ones that define you, and Bowie, that scared kid running out of time, became the performance Granger would be remembered for long after easier roles were forgotten. The studio cut 20 minutes from the film. After Nicholas Ray delivered his final cut, RKO executives watched it and decided it was too slow, too focused on character development when audiences wanted action. They ordered cuts. Ray fought back, but he'd already used up all his political capital getting the film made his way. He had no leverage left. So, the editors went to work, removing scenes that Ray considered essential. A sequence where Bowie and Kichi spend a quiet afternoon together, talking about their childhoods, discussing the normal lives they'd never have. A moment where Kichi watches Bowie sleep, her face revealing everything she's too scared to say out loud. Several extended takes of the landscape, wide shots that establish the isolation and emptiness surrounding these characters. All of it disappeared. The film that hit theaters ran just 95 minutes, tighter and faster than Ray intended. For years, he mourned those lost scenes, convinced the studio had gutted his vision. But decades later, critics argued that the enforced brevity actually strengthened the film, giving it a breathless, inevitable quality that matched the character's fate. The question remains unanswered. Was the theatrical cut better because of the studio's interference or despite it? Ray never made peace with it. He went to his grave believing the complete version would have been his masterpiece. The lost footage was never recovered, and somewhere in a forgotten vault, 20 minutes of Nicholas Ray's vision sits gathering dust, unseen and unmourned, except by the director who never stopped fighting for it. Robert Altman watched They Live by Night as a young filmmaker, and it changed everything. Years before he'd direct Maz H. or Nashville, Altman was studying how other directors approached intimate, character-driven stories within restrictive genre frameworks. Nicholas Ray's debut showed him it was possible to make a crime film that cared more about psychology than plot, that used noir conventions to explore loneliness and longing rather than just delivering thrills. Altman later cited They Live by Night as one of his primary influences, specifically Ray's use of long takes and naturalistic dialogue, his willingness to let scenes breathe even when the studio wanted everything faster and tighter. That influence showed up in Altman's own films decades later. The overlapping dialogue, the sense of characters existing in real time, the refusal to simplify human behavior into easy moral categories. Martin Scorsese also named They Live by Night as an essential film, praising Ray's ability to find violence in quiet moments and tenderness in desperate ones. Wim Wenders dedicated his film Lightning Over Water to Ray, a documentary about the director's final days that served as both tribute and eulogy. the influence spread beyond America. In Japan, filmmakers studying Hollywood noir discovered Ray and incorporated his techniques into their own crime films. They Live by Night became a secret handshake among serious filmmakers, a film that separated those who simply wanted to entertain from those who believed cinema could crack your chest open and show you something true. Nicholas Ray never made another film like They Live by Night. His subsequent career included brilliant work, Rebel Without a Cause, In a Lonely Place, Johnny Guitar, but none of them carried the raw, unfiltered quality of his debut. Some critics argue that's because RKO's interference and Howard Hughes's burial of the film wounded Ray in ways he never fully recovered from. He had poured everything into his first film, believing that if he made something good enough, honest enough, the system would reward him. Instead, the system buried it for 2 years and released it like an afterthought. That betrayal shaped everything that came after. Ray became more guarded, more willing to compromise, more cynical about the gap between art and commerce. He drank heavily, his marriages failed. His later films, while often brilliant, carried a darkness that went beyond the characters on screen. You could feel the director's own disillusionment bleeding through. By the 1970s, Ray was essentially unemployable in Hollywood, his reputation as a difficult, unreliable artist preceding him wherever he went. He died in 1979, never having received the recognition he deserved during his lifetime. But They Live by Night endured. It outlived the studio that buried it, outlived the system that broke its director, outlived every executive who thought it wasn't commercial enough. And in that endurance, there's a kind of justice. Ray didn't get his happy ending, but his film, his debut, his first statement about what cinema could be, it got to live forever. The final shot wasn't supposed to be the final shot. Nicholas Ray had scripted a different ending, one that offered a sliver of hope, a suggestion that maybe Kichi could survive, could build something from the ruins of what she'd lost. But when he filmed it, something felt wrong. It felt like lying. So he changed it on the day of shooting, replacing hope with honesty. The film ends with Kichi alone, driving away into darkness, her face revealing nothing and everything. It's ambiguous, devastating, and absolutely perfect. Ray didn't tell the studio he'd change the ending until it was too late to reshoot. They were furious, arguing that audiences needed closure, needed to know that tragedy could lead to redemption. Ray disagreed. He believed the only honest ending was uncertainty, because that's what life actually offered people like Bowie and Kichi. Not redemption, just survival, maybe. The controversial ending sparked debates that continue today. Some viewers find it too bleak, too unwilling to offer comfort. Others argue it's the only ending that makes sense, that anything else would have betrayed everything the film built toward. Ray never explained it. He said the ending spoke for itself, and if you didn't understand it, no explanation would help. That final image of Kichi's face, illuminated by dashboard lights and surrounded by darkness, became one of the most iconic shots in film noir, because it didn't promise anything. It just showed a woman driving through the night, alone, trying to figure out how to keep living when everything worth living for was gone. The film was remade in 1974 by Robert Altman, who titled his version Thieves Like Us, returning to Edward Anderson's original novel title. Altman had worshipped Nicholas Ray's adaptation for decades, but he believed he could dig even deeper into the source material, make it grittier, more naturalistic, more reflective of 1970s sensibilities. His version starred Keith Carradine and Shelley Duvall, and while it received critical praise, it lacked something essential that Ray's film had captured: the innocence, the desperate romanticism. Altman's version was harder, more cynical, more willing to show his characters as products of their environment rather than dreamers fighting against it. Both films are masterpieces in their own right, but they prove something important. You can remake a story, but you can't remake the moment that story was told. Ray made They Live by Night in 1948, when the world was still recovering from war, when people wanted to believe that love could save you even when logic said it couldn't. Altman made his version in 1974, after Vietnam, after Watergate, when that kind of belief felt naive. Same story, different hearts. And somehow, both films honor Edward Anderson's novel while revealing everything about the directors who made them.